All right. Hey everyone. Thanks for showing up. Um, so I wanted to take the opportunity to talk a bit about how to be a DM, what it means, slash GM, and all that good jazz. And I suspect this will probably take about maybe an hour or 2 hours long. And then I wanted to do a little bit of actual session planning since we're here. So when it comes to create or when it comes to being a DM, one of the first things that I have in mind is either I think of the world that it's set in, or I think about sort of maybe perhaps an overall story. So I mentioned before that I was planning on doing a one shot nature campaign, and I figured I would actually do some of that planning right here and now. Okay, fine, whatever. OBS, you do you. Anyways, so with this, because it's a themed campaign, specifically, I'm like, all right, well, this is gonna be nature based. Normally, what I think of is I'll think of the world. I'll think about like, does this world I'm making does it have any unique gimmicks? Like, for example, is it a series of floating islands with a molten core of power in the center of it? Is it a big spike that's hurling through space? Does space exist as we know it, or is it like a flat surface surrounded by, I don't know, fire or something like that? Or if I'm using, say, a default D&D setting where you have planets and there's different planes, is it taking place in one of the planes? With this, because I sort of already know the general sense of the theme of my setting, aka nature, instead I decided to go for story first. I asked myself, okay, what story is this? I have these PCs, and what objective is there? What's the story? What do I want to have happen? Well, since it's nature, we gotta figure out. There's probably some sort of overall threat. What is the threat? We'll say the threat in this case. We'll say that there is some force that is actively attempting to destroy nature. I can type word. Now, what is this active threat to nature? Is it a civilization? Is it an individual? Is it a force? Is it something else? Well, we'll say in this case, we'll go with the good old fashioned, we'll say it's a demon, right? We'll say some sort of demon has shown up into the world and has influenced and is influencing a society, and in this society, in the course of the society doing what it is, it's destroying the nature around. So then the question is the end boss the demon, or is the end boss the demon someone the demon's controlling? That'll be a question for later. Now, does the demon specifically want this nature to be destroyed, or is that a byproduct of what's doing? Me, I think it's sort of a byproduct, for example. Like, this nation is doing one thing, and it's destroying the nature as a result. And so the PCs are like, what's going on? They go in, they investigate. And the overall story is they go in and they successfully put an end to this danger. And by so doing, they solve some other problems the world's facing as well. Hooray! Everyone is happy. Now, with that being the case, I'm gonna pull up my favorite map maker ever, good old MS Paint. Now, there are significantly better map making programs out there than MS Paint, ones that have an easier job of doing it. The reason I use MS Paint is because it's kind of a quick and dirty kind of dealy. It's, I can do boom, boom, and be like, all right, so we've got, let's see here. So I know that there's a nation, and that's not what I want. There we go. Okay. So let's say I've got this nation. Let's say this is the rough shape of the world of where the plot's going to happen. And then we've got this nation, let's say over. Of course not. There we go. So we've got our nation in here, right? And we'll say there's another nation over here. And we'll say there's a third nation down here. And the players, where they live, is right here smack dab in the center. So this nation's coming over here to ransack and pillage this nation, and eventually come down here to this one as well. Well, obviously the players are right smack dab in the middle there. But now I have a visual representation of where everything is. And I can sort of adjust how big I want it. Maybe I want this nation here to actually be a little bit smaller. Like maybe so. Maybe this nation's a bit bigger. Or maybe it's a small nation as well. Either way, I now know, because I have a map in front of me, what's happening and where. And that to me is rather important. It's one of the reasons why I use Roll20, or I start using Roll20, is to me it helps to have a visual confirmation of where things are, because it helps me to orient where plot events are going to occur. Like let's say, for example, so right here's where the players are. Let's switch to this color. Let's say the overall goal is the players will march this direction. Along that road, let's say I want to have a plot event here, here, and maybe right when they enter the borders, and then maybe one here. And then run right here to get things started. Now, I want to take a quick step back and let's talk about these nations and about nations in general. So, when you've made your map, generally speaking, you're going to make a world that has nations. It's going to have various cultures and peoples of differing values and ideas. Of course, you can make whatever you want. You can make a complete homogenous world where everyone thinks exactly the same except for the PCs. You can make a world where there are no societies. I actually once set a game so far back in time they witnessed the birth of Bahamut, which in that particular pantheon was the god of dragons. So there was no societies or nations. They just didn't exist. Now that said, when you're making your nations, a couple of tips I would offer is there's a couple ways to approach it. Either you can either go with this is the nation of evil, this is the Tinkerer nation, this is the Nature nation. You're very simple nations. You can also approach it as this nation has a very strong nature theme, but there's a lot of other things to it, a more nuanced approach. How you treat your nations and your world map, for that matter, will reflect how your players will treat your map. For example, my using MS Paint will ultimately sort of detract a bit from a more serious nature if I want to use a more serious nature for my campaign, because let's face it, MS Paint is silly. This looks ridiculous and ugly and hideous. So as a result, the players will assume that this is a reflected amount of effort I've put into this. If I find a more proper map maker and actually take the time to make a map, players look at it and they will respect it, and they'll be like, oh, this is actually visually interesting and engaging, versus this is hideous MS Paint, what are you doing? Go back to kindergarten. And like I said, when you make your nations, how you treat them will sort of be an unintentional guide to your players of how to treat your world. For example, if you have very simple nations, this nation is the dwarves. Now, that's easy because when you say dwarven nation, people are like, okay, they live under the mountain, they mine things, they might have tinkerers, they have great warriors. I'm a bit of a dwarf fanboy if you haven't noticed. So on and so forth. It's very simple, very straightforward. And that can be very helpful when you don't necessarily need or have a lot of time, or when you don't have a lot of time and you don't necessarily want to put a lot of time into creating a nation. Because a lot of preset presumptions are in place and you can just build off of those. But if you say things like, oh, this is the water nation, and just leave it at that, or say, oh, that's the nation of whatever have you, and give it some name and don't address it, then your players will be like, all right, well, either this nation is something we don't need to worry about, so we're not going to talk about it, or the DM doesn't have anything planned. Let's go there. Or they might be like, well, the DM's treating, or the GM, for the matter, I'm going to say DM because I think DM's a cooler phrase. The DM clearly isn't really taking their nations very seriously. So why should we? Generally speaking, I find your players want to take things seriously, but they also need a reason to take things seriously. When I say seriously, I don't necessarily mean like super serious, like intense, but simply taking it as something sincere, something that is like, all right, this is actually worth, this is worth my attention and paying, looking at and actually like learning about. Versus like, this is the water nation, it's full of water clouds, and they're like, well, that's silly. Of course, truth be told, if I heard about a water nation full of water clouds, I might want to investigate that. But the point is that your players might see that as more of a joke and a gimmick than an actual interesting thing that's living and breathing. Because generally speaking, also, players are interested in nation or in settings that are alive, that are moving, that feel organic and natural. And it helps when your nations reflect that. Nations don't necessarily need to be themed. Because in real life, nations aren't themed, It's not like saying that this nation is themed around technology, or this nation is themed around money, or this nation is themed around military power, or whatever else have you. Nations are very nuanced and have a lot of facets to them. Now, I'm not saying you have to do that with all of your nations. I'm just simply pointing that out, that if you want to make nations, then figure out how you want to approach it, because how you approach your nations will affect how your players will approach your nations. And speaking of an organic world, let's talk about the history of your world. So let's bring back... There we go. Let's bring this back. Let's go to history. Wow, that's a really good spelling of history. There we go. All right. So the temptation is to write well, for me it is. The temptation is to write an extremely intricate, intense history of like the conquests of various warlords, and I've actually done that. I actually wrote a very long history for a world that I made. Personally, I think few are the players who have the time and disposition to sit through all of that. Unless you're a really good writer, I suspect few are the ones who want to sit there and read about all these historical events. Generally speaking, when I think of history, I say, okay, what has happened to cause the world to be in its present state? Because things always happen, or history happens as a reaction, or the present day is a sort of a reaction to what has happened previously. So using this nature theme that I use. So we have this world where we've got 3 nations on this thing. Where did my beautiful map go? Okay, here we go. So we've got this nation here, which is unbeknownst to the players, and the other nations, for that matter, is being secretly controlled by a demon. We have this nation over here that's being attacked, and this tiny little nation down here. What are these nations? What's the history here? Why are the players here in this little area? And why is nature so prevalent in this world? Well, for example, I don't know if I'll use it for this one shot that I'm planning, but let's say, for example, the concept of metal was never invented. So perhaps that's hindered technological progress for a while. And now this demon has come in from another world and has started influencing this nation with metal. Perhaps they now have this material that's come from a completely different world, and they've gone power hungry. Perhaps these nations, up to this point, have enjoyed relatively peaceful lives. It's been slow expansion. Perhaps the world itself is, the nature of it is a more fantasy nature. So in order to survive in it, you have to be somewhat magical. You have to have powerful individuals in your community to protect you from the dangerous flora and fauna that exist. So the nations are a bit smaller. The people are a bit ruddier, hardier. They're used to danger. And so as a result, they're nations that are more insular. They're nations that spread slowly, that are a little hesitant to trust outsiders because of so much danger that's around. And perhaps they're tired of it. Perhaps this nation here was just the residents wanted to expand more. They wanted more room to breathe. But it's difficult to expand because this is such a dense world. And so this demon shows up to its king or its queen or its ruler or its consultate, whatever form of government I choose to use, and it's like, look at this cool material I have. It shows them a metal axe. Boom! Down goes a tree. And the consultate's like, what is this marvelous power? And the demon's like, I'll give it to you. All you gotta do is just do a couple things I ask. And then, bada bing, bada boom. Suddenly, driven by their insatiable need to expand, because they need more breathing space, they've gone out. And well, it turns out this neighbor over here happens to have a nice little resource that this nation's always wanted. Boom! There you go. That's all the demon need to give him a little push, and now it's come to the point. Maybe the story starts right when this nation first marches into this nation. Maybe there's may have been a couple skirmishes, but this is the first time, like I say, an army has marched from here into here, and the poor players are caught in the middle. I haven't decided yet. But when it comes to your history, I would recommend that you keep a history that is, well, since we're here, I spell good. Oh, lost my train of thought. Oh well. But you get the point. Oh yes. And with your history, I would say keep it brief and keep it relevant. That said, also keep interesting tidbits in there for players to explore and to look to. For example, let's say I've decided that is the history that's brought the world to what it is now. But let's say at some point in history, metal had been around previously. Let's say en route, let's say about here, the players discover an ancient shrine that is buried for whatever reason, and it becomes unearthed, perhaps because of a battle they're in, or because of something happens, and, well, it's ancient ruins, and they feel some sort of something in there that calls them to it. And let's say the players decide to go in, and they discover ancient texts basically saying, we've discovered this marvelous material, but it's brought about so much destruction that we've decided to bury it and keep a record here so that if anybody should find it, they should know that this is a danger. And suddenly, and it talks about how this happened before, and there was a terrible genocide or something that occurred. And suddenly, the players are like, "Oh snap! This isn't an unprecedented event. This has happened before, but nobody remembers it." And they can see where this is going to lead. And that's a good way of getting your players a little more invested into the world, because history is a mystery, and people love mysteries, generally speaking. Now, taking a step back from history and into the modern world, let's talk about something smaller than nations. Let's talk about organizations. Organizations within your world are also, as a quick side note, for those of you who have joined us since then, this is streaming via our Twitch as well if you'd like to watch through there. There is a bit of a visual component to this, if you didn't already know. The link has been posted and pinned in general. Anyways, I'm not going to touch too much on organizations, but organizations are useful because they help. Organizations can be a little more stereotypical because they are based off of a certain purpose. For example, if you need an organization that the players need to work with, or I should say if you need, let's stick with that, then it might be helpful to have an organization that aligns with one or a few of the players' ideals. I like paladins, so let's go with some paladins. Let's say there's a paladin in the group, right? So you decide to incorporate into your setting a paladin order. And then you ask yourself, well, what's this order about? What's the purpose of the organization? How extreme is this organization? How big is this organization? So on and so forth. And generally speaking, when your players interact with an organization, they when they interact with members of the organization, they will be quicker to stereotype an organization than they will say a nation. Because generally speaking, organizations are made up of like-minded individuals. Um, oh, I should be smart. Whoops, that's not what I wanted. That's what I wanted. There we go. Okay. All right. Uh, to answer your question, yes, you can pop in and ask questions anytime. I realized I forgot to have Discord open. So if you have any questions, feel free to tag it. And if it sounds like I'm, in a sense, like I missed your question, feel free to tag me. Because I might be a little focused on the screen that I'm looking at right now and might miss your question in Discord. So this is it's a lecture, but it's also interactive. So you mean like a Q&A at the end? Ah, yeah, like I said, I have Discord open, so you can ask. You can go ahead and just drop a question directly into Discord, and I'll take a moment to answer it. That's probably the quickest and easiest way to go about it. Because if you pop in through voice, I might be talking and might miss you. But that said, since we are here, are there any questions or comments up to this point? Yeah. That absolutely is a good idea. The thing I would ask, though, of course, is why? Like, what happened? Because even in our modern society, we have civilizations and nations of different tech levels. You know, you have that's why we have like first, second, third world countries. So the question is, why is this nation more advanced than this nation? And are the various nations bothered by this fact? You know, is this nation low tech and they're perfectly okay with that? Does this high tech nation bully low tech nations? Does it seek to uplift them? So on and so forth. So having tech levels is definitely a good idea because it's also a great way to get the players to sympathize or react better or react more according to how you like to various nations. For example, I personally find myself I relate a little bit better with higher tech nations than lower tech nations. But at the same time, lower tech nations are stereotypically speaking more heartwarming because we usually associate them, or I should say, I associate them with characters who are like bold and brash and the who talk loud and maybe they're more of a warrior society and all that sort of thing. Any other questions? If not, I'll go ahead and move on to another important topic: NPCs. For those of you who may or may not be familiar with the term NPC, I suspect all of you are, but in case you're not, NPC simply refers to a non-playable character. These are characters that you, the DM or GM, control. The players, of course, control PCs or player characters. NPCs are everybody else in the world, bread and butter individuals. Generally speaking, the adventurers are not normal people. Most normal people in a world setting are peasants, farmers, in this setting, perhaps hunter-gatherers. They're not the stuff that's built for battle. They haven't been through harrowing adventures. Or maybe they're trades, they practice a trade for a living. Blacksmith, cobbler, so on and so forth. And it falls on you to make these characters and to play these characters. And the NPCs... Did somebody say something? Yeah, what's up? That's actually a very good point. And a consideration you do have to keep in mind, one that I admit forget. It skips my mind often. But so like if you were to say, for example, take the setting of Fallout, your bread and butter person probably is a bit more hardy than say modern day. That said, with your NPCs, they will be they're the face of your world. They are they will determine they will greatly determine how your players feel about the game, how the attitudes they bring to the table, how they feel about your world, and so on and so forth. For example, if every NPC they come across to is a bit of a buffoon and goofy and silly, then the players will come to expect, oh well, this is just the mode and tone of this world. It's goofy, it's silly, it's jokey, whatever have you, right? And then they might not take your NPCs seriously, assuming you want them to take your NPCs seriously. If every NPC they come across is heartwarming and loving and likable, eventually, perhaps they become sort of desensitized to it, and they're just like, oh, it's another one, or maybe they really grow attached to the world in general. Perhaps they see this world as something that's worth saving and fighting and protecting. If every NPC they come across is mean and nasty and harsh and treats the party poorly, then they won't want to interact with NPCs. They won't care about this world. They'd rather see it burn because all it's done is burn them. And as far as NPCs is concerned, to me it's important to have a variety of NPCs. It's important to have NPCs that are just parsley. They're just there to look pretty. Maybe they only have a couple of lines. NPCs that are... Some NPCs that are nasty, some NPCs that are very nice. Because it's just like, the world we live in. We encounter people like that all over the place. Some who are mean, some who are nice. When it comes to playing NPCs, generally speaking, the best way to go about, I find, is when I'm called upon to play an NPC, say a random person or shopkeeper or whatever else have you, I usually try to pick one or two character traits right out of the air really quick, if I don't already have something planned for them. For example, random peasant on the street. I'm going to assume this peasant is either A, busy and in a hurry, but will give the information, B, friendly and helpful, or C, just a little confused as to why they're being tagged by a random stranger. Like, what? Yeah, sure, it's over that way. And then the PCs will ask further questions, and either the NPC doesn't want to continue the conversation, so they'll try to end as quickly as possible, or they'll, stop, turn around, look at the group, and be like, oh yeah, well, let me tell you about that a little bit, and so on and so forth. Because that's another great thing you use NPCs for. It's a great way to build your world sort of organically. Because people are interested in the things around them. If there's a cool monument nearby and if the town like that monument, of course they're going to tell the players about that monument. They like that monument. If it's just been part of their lives the whole life and they're not particularly interested about it, why would they stop and tell the party, oh, let me tell you the history of this monument, even though I don't care about it? Go right ahead. That's also a very good point. Sometimes they don't understand the history of something correctly. Perhaps they've been informed incorrectly. Uh, generally speaking, NPCs, of course, will try and give you the correct information because that's how people work. Is generally speaking, they try to be helpful to each other. That said, like was said, sometimes it's not the case. So as a GM, don't be afraid to spice it up a little bit. I myself, I'm a little paranoid, and I don't typically do that. Because to be bluntly honest, I'm afraid my players will take it personally. Like, I'm personally trying to deceive them, even if that's not the intention. But, it's good to mix it up every once in a while. Now, that's just the bread and butter NPCs. Let's talk about the real NPCs. The ones with names and faces. The ones that your players either want to murder to death or, want to save and protect. when you're making an NPC, I find it helpful to consider the following things. One, if this is supposed to be an important NPC, one, I ask myself, okay, what purpose does this NPC serve? Who are they? Taking the game I'm currently DMing into account. If they're going to meet the head of a house, a noble house, I ask myself, okay, they are in charge. Why are they in charge? Is there something in their personality that denotes they're in charge? What has being in charge done to them? How do they feel about being in charge? How do they feel about their family members? How do they feel about the other members of the nobility? How do they feel about random adventurers walking in? And then I consider the context of their meeting the adventurers. Is it a random happenstance? Are they meeting them formally? So on and so forth. All these things will determine how they act and how they treat. And then I ask myself, well, who is this individual? They obviously fulfill a purpose, so they have some ability to fill that purpose, even if that purpose is just to give the players information. But then, who is their personality? I recently had a noble who was supposed to be the very symbol of decadence and extraordinarily unlikable. So when they met her, I played her to be exactly that. I probably went a little heavy-handed on it, but, I went with a whole hog. And I've had, other NPCs who were nice, who were very nice, very helpful. Generally speaking, if you want your PCs to hate an NPC, I find it helpful to think, okay, what sort of things do I hate in people? And then I create a nice collage of that kind of person into NPC. And if I want my PCs to like an NPC, I say, okay, what sort of traits are generally speaking liked? What sort of things will have the players react to them positively? Things such as shyness, I find. Maybe slight timidness. Not super timid, but slight timidness. Being very free with information. Being helpful. Taking suggestions. So on and so forth. Respecting the players. And of course, being in a position to help them in some way never hurts. And with your NPCs, I recommend erring on the side of a smaller number of NPCs. If you have a massive cast of NPCs and you expect the players to keep track of every single one of them, eventually they're just going to be like, who is this again? And they're going to turn to the guy or gal, for that matter, who's taking notes and be like, who is this? Now, that's not to say having a large cast is a bad idea or a wrong idea. It's just, generally speaking, I find it's easier to have a smaller cast, one on you, so you can keep track of who is who, but also, two, it's easier on the players, so it's less names they have to remember. Of course, I say this when my present game has a very large cast, but the world I'm running right now is it's supposed to be an open world, so it's kind of a beast of necessity. But that's beside the point. Yes. That actually brings up 2 points. One, I actually was about to go on to naming, funny enough. But also, as a DM, you have to be flexible. Sometimes you have planned for an NPC to be unimportant, but then the players sort of make them important. And as a DM, you have to be willing to sort of accommodate that. I'm not saying you have to, but you have to be flexible enough in order to do so, depending on the situation. I once had a DM who had an NPC. She was the head of a paladin order, funny enough, although my character was a scumbag and a half. He planned on... No, I'm sorry. A completely different character. Another character he had slotted to die. She was supposed to fall at the hands of the enemy. One of my characters stepped in and saved her life. She later ended up becoming the DM's PC. And ended up becoming a great character. So as a DM, sometimes you have to be like, okay, well, I wasn't planning on this NPC to become important, but it's really stuck with the players. I sort of enjoy this NPC, so let me just change my notes a bit, and now this NPC is more important to what's going on. You also have to be willing to accept that sometimes players don't care about NPCs you want them to care about. I actually once had an NPC that was supposed to be a central part to the events that were unfolding, but due to various reasons, that NPC ended up being completely forgotten, and eventually I'd be like, you know what, this NPC just, I can't find a way of fitting them into the story naturally. The players have moved on from them, so it's time to just write them out. And when it comes to naming, yes, have a list of names very handy. I do typically keep a document where I'll just have a bunch of names and there's nothing next to them. And when players encounter someone and need to introduce their names, I'll pick the name and then I'll take a quick note to remind me who they are. Like, peasant they met by the blacksmith. Yeah, yes, that would also be very helpful. Now, as far as like what makes a good name, don't ask me. I don't know. I'm terrible with naming. Go ask somebody else. That said, I will say with naming, try your best to avoid being super heavy-handed about it. I mean, I guess there's nothing wrong with having Zangorax, the Grand Lich of Misery, but it's a bit over the top. Instead, generally speaking, with your NPC names, I would recommend you stick to names that sound like actual names. You know, names that people would give each other, give themselves, so on and so forth. And I also highly recommend that if someone is important, giving them an important sounding name. Unless, of course, you're going counter type. Like, for example, if they're approaching the Grand Empire that has conquered nations and multiple worlds, and they walk up and all of a sudden discover that the Grand Emperor Knobbly Nick, the gnome, is sitting there playing with a toy on his throne and giggling incessantly, that might be a fun plot twist. You know what I mean? You might be like, wait, I'm sorry, what? Or, Jiggy Wiggy the cockroach. Yes. So generally speaking, I would say find names that sort of fit their position in society. Now I'm going to go ahead and move on to another topic, but before we go, are there any questions, comments? All right. And I'm not going to go into making bosses just yet. Combat will come at another time. So I want to talk about Session 0. But before I really go into Session 0, I wanted to ask you guys I want to do the things that all lazy teachers do. And be like, what do you guys think Session 0 is? What do you think its purpose is? So on and so forth. All right. There we go. So, Session 0, I'll be honest, it's a relatively new concept that I was introduced to, and I have mixed feelings about it, but on the whole, I like to use Session 0 to do all of that. Specifically, I like to use it to talk about the tone of the game, establish expectations, establish how meta things should be, for players to introduce their characters to each other in a non-RP sense, throw in a mock battle if possible, just so the players get a chance to fight as a team and see how they perform in combat, and then of course talk about anything else. And I want to delve into these a little more in detail. So I talk about tone of the game. I've mentioned it a couple of times. I like to run games that are more serious in tone. You know, I'm not opposed to laughs and giggles, whatever have you, but honestly, I tend to run fairly dark games. And I believe it's important for Session 0 to explain to your players, and for your players to explain to you, the sort of tone of, the tone. Like, say, hey, I want to play a rather dark campaign, and your player's like, well, I'm not really comfortable with dark themes. Do you mind if we lighten it up a little bit? And that's a good time to talk about that sort of thing. Or if you're like, hey, you know, I this quest is meant to be more linear. I plan on you guys going some sort of more from a plot point to plot point to plot point. I'm not going to railroad you guys, but that's sort of the intention behind it. And so your players can then decide, okay, one might be like, all right, that's cool. I'll, keep that in mind when I play a game. Others might be secretly to themselves like, excellent. Now to avoid all of the plot points. That's a really good point. I'm glad you mentioned that because there are some of us who are new, and that never hurts to say that. Say, hey, I'm new to this, and basically like exactly what you just said. Work with me on this. And this is also a good time to establish, like for me, whenever I run games, I always try to explain to people, I'm doing this also to teach new players how to play this game. So part of playing this will be me stopping the game and explaining mechanics as we go along. That will be part of the experience for new people. And I am perfectly willing and able to explain mechanics several times. So if players know that ahead of time, and say they're in the middle of an intense combat or even an RP session, all of a sudden I'll be like, all right, hold on a second. Now, in order to make a skill check, you roll a 20-sided dice and so on and so forth, right? If you establish all this ahead of time, it makes everything run a whole lot smoother. So your players know what to expect, you know what to expect, so everyone's on the same page. That is one of the biggest and most important things on it, and that brings into the expectations I mentioned. Your players can say, DM, or you can say, I expect you guys. And that's not the right way to put it, because I want to say, I expect you guys to follow the plot line. No, that's not the right tonality I want to use, or the right insinuation. It's more like you use this to establish. You say, "Hey, I'm planning on this being a fairly dark. I'm planning on this being a fairly serious campaign." And your player's like, "All right, well, maybe your players will be like, all right, we got that. That's cool." There's a good opportunity to expect your expectations from each other. Do your players expect you as a DM to be on the ball at all the time? Do they expect you to make a lot of house rules? Do they expect you to stop the session and make a lot of jokes? Do they expect snacks? And conversely, as now, because some of you might go on to play in real life, which would be great. No snacks for you. That said, also as a DM, you can you're like, all right, you can use this opportunity to figure out which of your players are more jokesters, which of your players are more interested in RP, which of your players are more interested in combat, so on and so forth. This helps you to understand what your players are bringing to the table, what kind of game they're looking to play. Because some people just want to kill things and get loot. That's not a bad way to play the game. If that's how they want to play it, that's their play style. If some aren't very interested in combat and just want to RP, that's also good to know in advance. So this is a good opportunity to establish from your players sort of how they want to approach the game and how they want to play it. That way you're not trying to force RP out of someone who has zero interest in RP. Because, to be frank, attempting to force someone to RP who has literally zero interest in RP doesn't usually end well. Now, speaking of which, I like to use this. Yes? That said, also, this would be a good opportunity to be like, please don't kill all my NPCs. I'd appreciate that. I do have a story in mind. You probably shouldn't actually say that, but. Oh, good. Oh, good. Now then. All right. I want to take a quick moment. I wanted to take a quick moment to talk about meta. So, I was in a game where, during non-combat sequences, we're all in character and we're doing a thing, and the moment combat started, all of a sudden we would just start talking strategy. Like, we'd sit down, look at the board, like, all right, I'm gonna go do this, I'm gonna do this move, and be like, all right, and then if you do that, I'm gonna do this. You know what I mean? Like, you were talking heavy strategy about how to go about it. And my DM wasn't comfortable with that. He's like, all right, I don't want you guys talking about your strategy out of character. If you're going to do that, I want you to be in the moment, in character, so on and so forth, right? And also, hold on, there's a pause because I'm thinking about what to say next. All right. So when I talk about how meta's thing is, it's important to establish how meta you as a DM are comfortable with your players being with each other and with you. For example, if it doesn't bother you that you've pulled a monster from page 13 or page 300 or 113 and your player knows that and just starts blurting the monster's stats all over the table, that makes sure they understand that. But if you've pulled a monster from the monster manual and one of your players knows it and you're not comfortable with them being like, oh, this thing has an AC of 13, let them know ahead of time. That way you're not stuck in this awkward players like, oh, I know that this thing has this ability that blah 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 explains to the other players, and you're the DM like, stop, no, that's not cool. And suddenly the table's like, this is awkward. What troll situation? Ah, okay, fair enough. Yes, so now, admittedly, that's a clever tip right there. To go in and change everything so your players think they know what they're up against, and they think they're clever and cheeky, but surprise. Yes. All right. Naturally. That's always a good way of going. That's always a good way of going about it, and providing that meta knowledge that they're seeking. It's slightly different than the topic I'm addressing, but still a good point. Knowledge checks are lovely and a fantastic way of giving information about the setting, the world, and the monsters. So, that said, oh, and speaking of which, since this topic's been brought up, when you're rolling a knowledge check on monsters, the question is always how much information do I give them? Do I just set an arbitrary DC and then just give them everything? Do I give them scaling knowledge, so on and so forth? I like scaling knowledge, i.e., the higher the roll, the more they know about the monster. And then I like giving the information. This is just a personal thing. I like giving the information more through flavor text rather than simply saying it's vulnerable to fire. I say things. Well, you've heard legend. You've heard that flames really hurt this thing. It's not the most descriptive way of going about it, but oftentimes, I'm in the middle of combat and I don't really have time to drop a full narrative. So that said, this is another reason why it's important to establish with your players sort of that precedence of meta. Like, will you just flat out tell them the AC of a monster where they figure out, like, yeah, it's AC 13, or you say, oh, pretty close, and just never tell them. So I think it's important to establish this. Moving on. So, when I mentioned players introduce the characters in a non-RP sense, this is where I think it's important that players discuss their characters, like what their theme is, what their build is, if they have a specific build, kind of what they're doing for, what they're going for. And this will allow players, if they want, to sort of synergize a little bit. And this, of course, goes back into the meta thing. If you want your players to synergize ahead of time. If you don't want them to synergize ahead of time, then obviously, beyond just saying, oh, I'm going to play a cleric, I'm going to play a fighter, I'm going to play whatever have you, don't let them talk to each other about their characters per se, although good luck stopping them. But I find it helpful because then players can be like, oh, you're going to pick up Path of the Fey Lord? Okay, that'll go great. That'll synergize great with this ability. Or like, I was waffling on which spell to pick for my 3rd level slot, but if you're going to grab that ability, I'll grab this spell. You know what I mean? It's a great opportunity to help them build that connection early, at least in a meta sense. This is, again, why the previous precedence was important to be established. And you as a DM have to figure out how much you want your players to interact and synergize with each other. Now, you as a DM can just be like, all right, y'all can look at each other's character sheets, but build your character without knowing what the other one does. You can't be like, oh, this person has Summon Monster 3. Well, I won't pick Summon Monster 3 because they got it. You know what I mean? But also with this, if they introduce to you, the DM, formally what their character's about, what they're going for, then you as a DM know what to expect. If I am playing a rogue who's on the path of salvation, who's trying to change his past and try and use his skills for good, then the DM recognizes that's my goal. That's what I'm trying to do. And the DM can plan for that, either by putting situations that will help further my goal or hinder my goal, and also help me become more emotionally involved in the events that are unfolding. Plus, it helps you as a DM sort of plan encounters accordingly. And after all, as a DM, it's a special feeling when you have a really cool thing planned and your players pull something out that you didn't expect, and suddenly this really cool encounter you had planned suddenly becomes a laughing stock. Your players enjoy it, but you as a DM, you're like, oh, my encounter. Okay. It's going to happen. That's the fact. Like, you just have to accept the fact that there are times when your players are just going to do things you didn't expect, and sometimes it's great, and sometimes it's awful. That's just how it is. Before I move on, is there anything anybody wanted to say about introducing characters, themes, builds, so on and so forth? I'm glad you brought that up, because I also think it's worth taking the time to talk to each of your players individually to discover their goals. Talk to them, sit them down, like, all right, tell me the stuff that you're not telling the other players, because, to be fair, many PCs like having secrets that they don't want the other players to find out right away. They want that to unfold over time. Now, if you're the sort of DM who wants to work with your players and help their plans unfold, that's important. Keep in mind, not all DMs are that benevolent. Some DMs, if you tell them your plans, will try and cause you to fail. Which is why it's important to sort of fill out your DM and figure out exactly what kind of person they are, because hopefully they're nice. Oh yes, and I do want to point out as well, it's important to establish how approachable you are as a DM. Like, if, for example, if you're just like, I'm just here at DM, don't talk to me otherwise, it's important your players know that ahead of time. Versus, like, I'm intensely interested in everything your character's about, give me every single minor detail and I will memorize it. I sort of fall halfway towards the two. But I tend to get lost. All the details tend to get lost. As far as players are concerned. Sorry, players. Now, I want to move on real quick. I feel like there's one more thing that should be mentioned. Is there anything anybody else wants to say before we move on? Alright, well anyways, I want to talk quickly about doing a mock battle. Because doing a mock battle, it gives you practice as a DM when it comes to crafting it. At least crafting against this particular group. So, with the most recent one, I tried to run 3 different difficulties of battle. I tried to run an easy, medium, and hard encounter, and then gauge the players' actions, reactions, and their characters' actions as well. That way I can be like, all right, this sort of encounter isn't going to work, this sort of encounter is going to work, this is not going to be okay, this is going to be okay, that sort of thing. And the players themselves get to see how their character performs in combat, and they get to see how the others perform in combat. Because sometimes when you're building a character, you come up with an interesting mechanic, you put it down, and then you start the game, and you discover session 2, your mechanic doesn't work at all. It's just broken, and suddenly you're stuck with this character, with this mechanic, and you can't get rid of it. However, if you have this mock battle ahead of time, they discover the flaw and like, oh, oops, I didn't realize it didn't work the way I thought it did. They can change that. Which also brings up another interesting point, which I think is probably why I should have mentioned this. As a DM, please explain to your players what they can do, if anything, to change the mechanics of their character. If you want to be a hard attack DM and say your decisions are final, that's fine. Just make sure your players know that ahead of time. If you want to allow for retraining, that's also okay. Just, again, let them understand what they can retrain, how they can retrain it, so on and so forth. In addition to any optional rules you may or may not be including, may or may not be including when it comes to character creation, such as optional races, optional rules, so on and so forth. I think that's it for session 0. Is there anything anybody else wants to bring up before we move on? All right. Let's go ahead and move on to session 1, the first session, specifically introducing the party to itself. First off, it's going to be awkward. I've never had a first session that wasn't awkward. I'm sure they exist. I'm sure they happen. It hasn't happened to me. Even when I'm playing with longtime friends, it's still mildly awkward. That said, well, it's mildly awkward partly because there's a bit of a disconnect. On the one hand, generally speaking, your characters are brand new to each other. They've never met, but you as the players recognize you're supposed to be together as a group. So the question is, how do you transition that into your character? Even if, like, normally speaking, your characters wouldn't get along. If it's awkward, that's fine. It's just normal. Don't worry about it too much. But there's some tips I've come across, some helpful ideas to help make that first session a little bit easier, to flow it in. Let's see here. One tip I find that is helpful is combat is usually a helpful way of going about it. It helps the players establish very quickly their allies. They can talk about what they saw each other do during the combat. For example, if, say, someone who looks relatively normal suddenly, like, jumped off the top of a building, ripped open the sky, and summoned down, like, massive demons to crush their foes, the other players are probably going to want to talk about that. They're like, what the flip was that? But there's a short list I've compiled. And it's not, as people love to put with their caveats, it's not a comprehensive list. But it's a little list that I think would be... Actually, I'm just going to go ahead and wait for my computer, because it's a little slow, unfortunately, for some reason. I'll just list them while my computer is loading. One is the party itself or some of its members already have a history together. Maybe they've known each other, they've worked together in previous, whatever have you. It's a little awkward because they sort of have to figure out something that they did together that they didn't actually play together. Although you could pre-construct that as well. Perhaps the party's already heading to a common objective. Perhaps they meet on the road on the way to something. Perhaps the party's waiting for a particular event to occur. Perhaps they've been summoned together and they're waiting for someone to arrive to introduce them. Or perhaps they're sitting at the junction of a road, expecting something to occur. Or perhaps they meet at some sort of, we'll say, stellar phenomenon where they're sort of sitting around waiting for the meteor shower to happen. So on and so forth. A popular one is starting the party off with an attack. Starting off, say they're in the middle of a battle zone. They've been captured. They're all stuck in the same cage together. They're in a town that's under siege. So on and so forth. Perhaps part of the party must rescue another part of the party. Perhaps you plan on starting your first session with, let's say you have 5 players. Let's say you plan on starting with like 3 or 4 of them. And in the pursuit of their first session, they discover the other 2 party members and rescue them. Another way you go about it is just they're tossed together by the threads of fate. Perhaps fate has brought them together, either using the previous cage scenario. Perhaps they're all slaves together. Perhaps there's a crash and they're the sole survivors of this crash. So on and so forth. And another one that I'm partially fond of is the party all happens to be in the same place when a really surprising event happens. Something that is a bit shocking, something that is a bit unexpected. Oh, just put that right there. So on and so forth. And as a result, they're the only ones who know about it, who know the truth behind it, so on and so forth. I'm going to go ahead and post this right here. Then I'm going to go ahead and repost this up in Discord. Whatever. Again, this isn't a comprehensive list. This is just simply a few ideas to toss out there of things you can do with Session 1. And now I'd like to ask if any of you have any potential ideas or have been exposed to Session 1s that were extremely successful and how the DM went about it. Anyone? Fair enough. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next topic. This topic is a very harsh topic and a bit of a sharp departure from what we've talked about thus far. And this one is troublesome players. Because let's face it, this is a game this is a social game, which is terrifying to contemplate, considering I am a rather antisocial or unsociable fellow. But sometimes, and generally speaking, the people who play with will be pretty cool. But sometimes you do get players who are just problematic. And the question is, how do you recognize them and what do you deal with them? In my experience, some of the most telltale signs, there's a few of them. One is the other players at the table don't feel comfortable around them. They bring to the table something that makes the other players kind of not want to be there. They're uncomfortable. They're sort of shifting in their seats. So on and so forth. Perhaps the player is domineering. Perhaps the player is making snide comments on the other actions of other players. And perhaps they are sort of, to use a modern vernacular, they're a bit toxic, shall we say. Another one is if your other players feel intimidated that they can't do things unless the player in question approves them or their character would approve of them. A common example that's brought up is, what do you do if you're the party rogue and there's a paladin in the group? I can't do my rogue things, because if I do, the paladin either A, has to stop being a paladin, or B, has to openly reprimand me and chastise me. And as a player, I don't want to deal with that. That's just using an example. That particular scenario is a corner case that's worth addressing later. But for example, if that character or that player doesn't let other players do the things they want to do, reasonable things that they want to do. If you have a player who's trying to stop other players from constantly murdering every innocent NPC you come across, that's a little different. But that might be that strikes me as a sign of a problematic player. Another one is just that the player's just straight up hostile to you or the other players, be it openly or subversively. Passive aggression is a thing, and you have to recognize that this player is making a lot of nasty comments behind my back about me, about the other players. They're constantly complaining. Essentially, at the end of the day, they're making this. They're making the scene unpleasant for everyone. And then one of the other ones that comes to mind is if they're unwilling to compromise or work with you. Using the previous example, let's say the paladin and the rogue, right? So let's say the paladin player talks to the rogue player and like, all right, look, I understand that you're a ne'er-do-well and you're a thief. But I'm willing to turn a blind eye to your activities, provided, as far as I know, they're for the greater good. You know what I mean? Or perhaps the paladin player just doesn't say anything when the thief does the thief things. That sort of player is willing to make a compromise. But if that paladin player comes down and starts preaching to that other character in game and that player about being a rogue, and they make it impossible to be a rogue, and they're just really hammering them on it, that's a problem. And that's a problem that will need to be addressed. Because it could be a fighter, it could be a druid. You could have a druid player who's like, no one has to wear metal. Period, the end. And the party fighter's like, I'm going to stay on my full plate. Thanks. And there's a few other problems, but I can't think, or a few other signs that come up, but I can't quite think of them off the top of my head. But one of the biggest indicators is how do the other players feel about them, and how do you feel about them? If at the end of the day it feels like the situation, if you guys aren't having fun, and this person is the epicenter of that reason, then something needs to be done. Now, there's a few ways of approaching this. The best way I find is to talk to them directly first. Pull them aside at some point. I wouldn't do it during the session, but some point, during the week or whatever have you, pull them aside and speak directly to them. Don't publicly chastise them. Sometimes that makes it worse, and sometimes it just makes it really awkward. And when you are talking to them, be very clear about what the problem is. With example here is all right, look, I understand you're a paladin, and you feel that if you allow the rogue to do what the rogue does, you won't be able to stay a paladin again. I understand that conflict, but the rogue is the rogue player isn't feeling very comfortable. Or if you don't want to single out the rogue player, you're look, I understand you're willing to take your paladin duties very seriously, and I appreciate that. But you need to be a little more lenient on them. It's affecting the party and how they're able to do things. As a DM, I'm not going to penalize you if you associate yourself with the other party members who are doing things that are questionably against your code. Because ultimately speaking, what goes against your code is up to me. And I feel it'd be better for the party if both you and I were lax on that sort of thing. So next time we come down, would you mind being a little more lax about it and not being so uptight? If you feel it's helpful to say the party rogue is coming to me and complaining that they feel they can't do it because you'll lecture them, that might be worth mentioning too. But always be clear about what you're talking about. Ambiguity, beating around the bush, doesn't help the problem. It just makes it unclear and can broil resentment or harbor resentment. And when you're talking to them about, be tactful. Breaking down the door and setting it on fire with vitriol and anger won't really solve much. And sometimes it's a sensitive situation, sometimes it's not. If it is a sensitive situation, it's important to treat it that way. And figure out how you want to say it without anybody necessarily looking like the bad guy. It sucks. It's really hard. It's nerve-wracking. And sometimes it doesn't work, but sometimes it does. And I am a strong proponent of trying that approach first. If you don't find tact works, then sometimes you have to be a little more blunt. You have something to say? All right. And then the last and foremost, of course, is don't be afraid to bring the hammer down in a sense. Don't be afraid to stand your ground. And this extends not only to problem players, but just in general. As a DM, sometimes you just kind of have to stand your ground. Like sometimes players will be like, well, according to the rules, this, that, and the other, or like, well, this is a dumb thing, and da 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 da, and so on and so forth. Sometimes as a DM, you have to be like, you know what? I don't care. That's where I stand, and that's where things are. In this case, you have to be like, you know what? You need to relax. In this case, you're like, you know what? You're not getting along with the party. You either need to make a change, or I will make a change for you. And I would say be clear about what you want to do. Like, say, if it's really bad, say, look, if you don't improve, I'm going to kick you from the group. I'm sorry, but that's what it's going to have. That's the only solution I see in front of me. Or like, you know, I don't think you're being a paladin-like. You need to change your class. Don't be afraid to do it. As a DM, sometimes you have to do that. But when you do so, do what needs to be done and do it quickly and no more. And if you can, try not to burn your bridges afterwards. And if the player understands clearly why you're doing what you're doing, then sometimes that helps to make things a little bit easier. I've had to kick a player from my group before, and it was just, I won't go into the story exactly why, but when I did it, I explained to him, look, it's just, for now, you're out of the group. Excuse me. So I want to shift gears to a related note, but before I do, any questions or comments? All right. So I want to talk about actually running the game. You know, the bread and butter, the nuts and bolts of it all, and how it works, like how to do this DM thing. First and foremost, I find it's helpful to keep a good flow of energy. You know, if you're excited and you're eager to be there and you're interested and you're excited about what's going to happen, generally speaking, your players will pick up on that and they'll sort of feel the same way. And when it comes to being a DM, try and keep whatever's going on as clear as possible to the players. It's very easy for players and DMs to become desynced from what's going on. Sometimes players just space out for a few minutes. Sometimes something's going on that's not interesting to them, so they'll just sort of tone out for a bit, and all of a sudden they're like, wait, what's going on? When they're asked what's going on. As a DM, never assume that all of your players, I should say, know exactly what's going on at the same time. And even the players who are active, sometimes they misunderstand what's going on. You know, perhaps one player is assuming the group is walking and talking, while another party member is assuming that the party is standing still and talking. That's a miscommunication I see often. You know, always make sure that whatever is unfolding around them and in front of them is clearly communicated so that everyone's on the same page. And don't be afraid to make sure that everyone is. You know, stop like, all right, does everyone understand what's going on? Maybe not quite that question, but, you know, take a moment to re-explain what needs to be done. And don't be irritated when you have players asking you, wait, I'm sorry, what did you just say? Or, could you explain that again? You know, be patient, because players will do that, and then you'll have to explain it, which is fine. But if you don't like repeating yourself, mention so during session 0. Like, I don't like repeating myself. I'm not going to repeat myself. So, if you repeat myself, too bad. In addition to this, when you're going through, try and give your players tangible options they can take. A lot of times when players are silent or they're not sure what to do is because, well, they don't know what to do. They don't know what to engage with. They don't know what options they have available to them. They don't know where to go, so on and so forth. So by presenting your players options and things they can do and work with, then that gives them something, oh, I can do that. I know how to work with that. Like, for example, well, you arrive in the town, and you describe 3 different stores or 3 different buildings that people can go to, in addition to, say, 2 NPCs who look mildly interesting walking around on the streets, and then say, what do? Some of the players like, oh, I want to do this, I want to do that, I want to do this, and they're like, well, I'm not sure what I want to do. I'm like, all right, and you can be like, all right, I'll get back to you in a minute, and then you go to the other players and see, let's say one wants to go to the blacksmith that has a giant pair of dragon wings coming off the top of it. The player is like, what the what's the deal with the dragon wings? And there isn't any magical number, because another way of looking at it is that there's an overarching objective that they're trying to get to, and you present to them viable options to get to that objective, that helps as well. Having a clear purpose will help players to be able to navigate through your world and do so willingly and happily. Because being aimless in a D&D world isn't a very good feeling. You're just sitting there, you're like, I want to play this game, but I don't know how to play it. What do I do now? Oh yes, and of course, as a result, you'll have less awkward pauses. I mean, awkward pauses are going to happen. It is what it is. Hashtag deal with it. So, taking a step back, as a DM, make sure you know the rules of the game you're playing. I know it seems kind of like a no-brainer, but make sure you understand the system that you're using. You don't necessarily have to have the rules memorized, although it's helpful, particularly when you're dealing with that player. You know what player I'm talking about. Yeah, I'm talking to you, Mr. Rules Lawyer. But having a firm grasp on them, firm enough grasp that if you modify them, you can do so with confidence and with a decent enough explanation. You're still going to get players that no matter what you do are going to be like, by the book, or they're going to poke holes in what you do, or they're going to try and find ways of exploiting your system intentionally or unintentionally. That's going to happen, and you just have to learn to basically like how to work with that. Sometimes you... Go ahead. Thank you for bringing that up. When I say rules lawyer, I mention specifically those people. We all know what that means, but for clarity, people who are sort of obnoxious in the strict interpretation of a rule. Now, if you've done something wrong as a DM, you have to, of course, be willing to accept, like, oh, oops, I didn't realize it worked that way. Like, oh, I forgot about that rule. And then you figure out what to do with it. Either you incorporate that rule, you correct what you've done, whatever have you. Because no one's perfect. We all make mistakes. And by the way, players, be patient with your DM. We're not perfect. Occasionally we make mistakes. We break rules by accident. Happens. Now, if you have someone who's a rules haggler, that's an entirely different kettle of fish. You have to figure out, okay, how much cheese am I okay with? What is, to me, the letter of the law says this is okay, but to me, the spirit of the law says it's not okay. Yes, I know that person. I've come across them. Come again? No, what Unicorn just said. But when the situation is reversed, all of a sudden they're, yes. Yeah, I've come across people like that. At that point, you have to figure out which precedent you want to stick with. And you have to explain to your players, a lot of these things goes two ways. Just because you may be immune to mind control in this corner case, well, guess what? The monsters will be as well. And part of me is inclined to be like, well, the player doesn't like that. Well, too bad for that player. They probably deserved it, but that's not a very nice way of thinking about it. With this sort of people, you have to learn where to stand your ground. You have to be like, no, I know it says by the rules that's technically okay, but I'm not okay with that. So I really don't want to have that be a thing. The rules are that they exist, but ultimately speaking, as the DM, you are the law. What you say is the law, is the law, is the law. Period. The end. Of course, abusing that power will make your players leave you. They do, and I believe rightfully so, expect some consistency with the rules, particularly as written in the books. But ultimately speaking, it is up to you to interpret the rules as you see fit for your particular game, which, as mentioned before, I think is another important thing to establish during session 0, to explain as a DM how strict you are about the rules and how open you are to your interpretation of them. Also, that's a good thing to bring up. I'm glad you mentioned that. Yes, yes. Having house rules is always a good. Well, having house rules I think is a good idea. If you don't want to have house rules, yes, having written house rules is par excellence. And having them available for the party to see. Now, of course, you don't have to have home rules. You can go with the rules straight, and that's fine. Just, whatever you do, make sure your players know going into character creation from the very get-go. So yeah, as the rules, make sure you know them well enough so that you can alter them and change them, at least with confidence and the ability to explain so you know what you're doing, rather than blindly stumbling through and discovering you've broken something fundamental and important. Like saying, oh no, the attack rolls, you make those with a d6, and suddenly being confused as to why your players aren't hitting anything. Yes, we'll get into monster design later. So for now, before I move on, does anybody want to talk about or make any comments about or have any questions about knowing the rules as far as being a DM is concerned? Yeah. Also, as a note, sometimes as a DM, sometimes you're wrong. Sorry, sometimes you are the one in the wrong, and you have to be willing to accept that. Uh, I find it's helpful if it's uncertain to run with that for now and then to address it afterwards. Unfortunately, usually we end up forgetting, but I find that to be the quick and easy way of doing it. All right, well, let's run with that for now. Then once session's over, we'll go ahead and look it up and then discuss it and figure out what's going on. Because at that point, the conversation can be a little more civil. It doesn't interrupt the flow of what's going on, and things can carry on as normal. You know what I mean? Although if your players start abusing that temporary ruling in that combat as much as they can, then as a DM you might want to do something about that. So, go ahead. Alright, I want to shift gears real quick. Let's slice up to the time before and after a session. Both these times are important. Generally speaking, when you all get together, you all want to just chat up, ask talk about stupid things, ask questions to the DM, whatever have you. I like to call it the wind up in a sense, maybe the pregame. I don't know, whatever you want to call it. The point is that moment before the game happens, and this is very important. You have to give time for this to happen and to unfold, because it's during this time everyone kind of gets into the mood. Everyone's and bouncing off each other's feelings. If someone's having a tough day, others can help them feel better about it and get ready for the session. It's a good time for players to ask DM about things, perhaps using the example we just mentioned. Perhaps the player's like, oh yeah, by the way, DM, you mentioned that we would talk about this after the combat last time, but we didn't get around to it. Like, oh yeah, let me look at that real quick. And you talk about it before you go into the session, so on and so forth. It's very important. Make sure you have time for that. And then, of course, when the time comes, go into the session. After the session is over, I love having a bit of time to wind down afterwards. For me, it's usually about 30 minutes or 45 minutes. That's usually how long it lasts for me. Sometimes it's a couple hours. It depends. But also important. Because that's the moment where your players get to talk about the things that happened in it. They can speculate. They can talk to you. You can basically be like, yeah, so with that encounter, I had this idea in mind. You can get some feedback. Like your players like, that was not cool. Like that, could you not do that ever again, please? Or others like, that was awesome. Like that was really like, and so on and so forth. And it's a nice, the fancy was denouement, I believe is the word I'm looking for. Ooh, look at my fancy college education. But basically it's an unwinding, a release of all that build up, because playing D&D is a pretty emotionally intense experience usually. And having that moment afterwards sort of release all of that and get it out is very helpful. And I like to ask for feedback too, but I hate to tell you this. Well, okay. Let me start back. It's also a good time to ask for feedback. However, in my experience, I have found that generally speaking, players don't give a lot of feedback for one reason or another. Exactly. If you guys have any ideas, suggestions of tips that I can do better, let me know. They never do. Now, out of fairness, there's part of the reason why is because as players, they may not know what you can do better. They may not know what suggestions to give. They may not be thinking about that. They might not want to influence you. They might not want to influence your story. They might not want to influence your play style. They might not want to seem like they're ungrateful or, whatever have you. So, and that's another good point that Pincus brings up. A lot of times you don't even think about what's unfolded. You're not analyzing it from a meta standpoint. You're in the zone, and then it's over, and the game's like, well, how'd I do? And they're like, I don't know. I was playing my character the entire time. Like, I wasn't aware 3 hours just happened. Like, what do you want me to say? Like, add more orcs next time, I guess? Question mark? Give them tattoos in their faces? I don't know. But asking for feedback isn't terrible. It's just, don't be surprised if you don't get any. And I do want to mention, because as Pincus just brought up, at the end of the day, it's a game. Everyone should be having fun, including you, the DM, or GM for that matter. If you're not having fun, then something is wrong. And speaking of which, during the session, I see during the session, how focused should you be? Like, what happens when your players start joking around or you get off topic, whatever have you? Again, important to set the precedence ahead of time. But yes, it's important to allow players to get off topic a little bit from time to time. Being hyper-focused for 3 hours straight is exhausting and draining, and it's hard. So it's okay to, like, every once in a while, like, like, let them joke about this or that, get them off, or whatever have you. Even taking breaks during session, like taking a 30-minute breather, if you're gonna have a longer session, is a good idea. 15, 30 minutes, however long. As a DM, though, you need to learn how to pull them back on track. You need to learn when enough is enough, and be like, all right, guys, let's get back. Let's go ahead and get focused here again, and then get things back into the zone and moving along. And that's a trick that takes a bit of practice to learn how to do. But generally speaking, some tips I find to help bring things back on track is look for look for tie-ins to what's going on. Like if the players are off topic and they're chatting, whatever have you, and they mention something that's related to what's going on, and you say you can usually mention that and tie that back into what's happening, and some of the players are like, oh right, let's get back on task. Or perhaps after a joke has been told, there's and there's a brief moment after it's been told, and there's like a pause. Like, all right, let's get back on topic, guys. Let's get back focused. Or what are you doing, or whatever have you. And then actually, Pingus brings up a good point, and another topic I want to talk about. When you're DMing your players, RP is extremely important. Obviously, it's part of the game. The question is how much RP is too much RP? When to let them RP? What's okay to RP about? So on and so forth, etc., and so on. There's no such thing as too much RP, as long as the RP is productive. When I say productive, I mean there's a purpose to it. There's something happening there's something unfolding it. Even if it's something as simple as two characters developing an opinion about something. If characters are just RPing for the sake of RP, or they're in a sense sort of wasting time, that's when you kind of need to step in and keep things moving along. And identifying what I like to call useful RP. Useful RP should be given as much time to unfold as it needs. If it takes an entire session, so be it. That said, you also need to be careful of players who are very RP heavy. And RP heavy, when I say that, I mean they'll sit there and they'll talk for an hour straight with like an NPC. When that's happening, usually I'll usually give a PC about 10-15 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, before I'll say, all right, I'll get back to you in just a moment, and then I'll ask the other players what they're doing during this. Because it's important that the other players recognize that they're still engaged in the narrative, they'll still engage what's going on, and then depending on what the player's going to do, I say, all right, we'll get back to what we're talking about in just a second. I want to handle this right quick. And then you handle this little thing. You're like, all right, remind me once we're done here. And then you go back to what you were doing. Never let a single player or two players completely dominate what's going on. Always try and make sure your other players are involved. And like I said, stop it for a moment if you need to make sure they're still involved. But always, my advice would be always to do so with the clear intention of coming back. Essentially figuring out how to prioritize who's doing what and when. Because nothing feels worse as a player when you are like, I really want to RP something at this moment, and you can't get a word in edgewise because the other players are too busy talking, and you really, really want to say it. It feels horrible. And I'm sure all of you here who have done RP have been through that situation and have sit there like, DM, please, I'm raising my hand. I'm dying, please. And that's a good point. That's why I bring up what I did. You have to learn to recognize also when you can interrupt RP and when you can't interrupt RP. That's usually why I wait about 15-20 minutes if it's that long. And if I find like a brief moment where I can pause and I feel like I can continue the flow, I'll just offer a brief pause and ask the other players what they're doing really quick, and then go back to it. Exactly. Always pay attention to good points, interrupt things. So I want to shift real quick to designing encounters in 5th edition. Actually, do I want to do that? Actually, no, I don't. I lied. I don't want to shift to that. Instead, I'll talk about not the mechanics of designing monsters in 5th edition, because I hate the mechanics of it. Instead, I'll talk about the thematic construction thereof. Um, not all combats have to be memorable, but no two combats should ever be exactly the same. And combats, depending on your PCs, can be viewed at in a few different ways. For some, some players will view combat as a drain on their resources, and they will try and use as few resources as possible for fear of something big at the end. I mean, after all, it'd be terrible to waste that spell you've been waiting for the big boss. Other players still enjoy combat and love getting into it as much as possible. When it comes to combat, when I design combat, first off, well, I tend to err on the side of easy, unfortunately. My encounters aren't typically very difficult. But as a DM, that's because I'm too afraid of killing my players as a DM. A sense of danger is good. A sense of like every combat being a struggle for life and death, that's a bit much. Unless you like Dark Souls. In which case, good on you. I'm sure you loved. And I had a DM who, are you referring to the Black Sun, like the old PC game? Like TSR Black Sun? Because if you are, that is Dark Sun as I'm thinking of. Anyways, that is, holy hell, it's a throwback. Anyways, I have a DM who loves designing extraordinarily hard encounters, and every fight is really hard. I don't like that because it just makes combat so draining and hard, and eventually the thrill of victory is lost in the fear of combat. That said, if your combats are always easy, then they just kind of become like these annoyances that stop the narrative. And it's like, okay, well, we were doing something interesting. Now it's only we have to fight because reasons. With your fights, I would suggest you always find a way of having them fit. Don't have a fight for the sake of a fight. You know, if the players are going into a dungeon and they're going to get ambushed, there's a reason for that ambush. You know, if they're going to go into town and there's no many combats in there, you know, try and make sure that the combats they come across are fairly logical and have some sort of meaning in relation to what's going on. Also remember, fights do drain your party's resources. And so if you have a big boss fight planned at the end of it, and you plan on them going through like 20 fights beforehand, and suddenly they get to the boss and they're all out of resources, that's also that's not where I was going with that, but yes, that too. As a DM, be dynamic. Adjust your encounters. If an encounter is supposed to be too easy, find a way of buffing up the difficulty, even in combat sometimes. Have reinforcements show up that were like totally planned the entire time. Of course they were. They've been sitting there in my notes. What are you talking about? You know, modify the boss as needed coordinates. The point I'm bringing up is your PCs have limited amount of resources, and it's important to gauge and try and guess about what they will expend as they progress through. You obviously can't fully predict PC's actions. Like, for example, you may have a wizard who decides to spend all of his spells on the first encounter, and you are expecting a more staggered approach. Well, oh well. But when you give me just a second, sorry. So to plan your combats according to the sort of feeling you want your players to have by the end of it. Do you want them to be tired and exhausted by the time they reach the end? Do you want them to, feel fully confident they can take on this boss fight? So on and so forth. And then designing boss fights, that's a whole other kit and caboodle on itself. First off, single monster bosses rarely work very well. And by that I mean a single turn. This boss monster has a ton of HP, has a bunch of really cool attacks, but only gets a single turn. usually doesn't end well. The reason being is because a lot of times players have shutdown abilities. So what'll happen is your boss may never get a turn simply because the players keep shutting them down. And also, the combat, at least in D&D, is designed against a multitude of targets. That includes how much damage the party is taking, how much damage the party is outputting, so on and so forth. So I find it helpful to have a boss either to have assistance or multiple turns. And then if they're going to have multiple turns, have some sort of excuse for that. Otherwise, players are like, oh, they get multiple turns? Well, okay, DM, whatever. And of course, boss fights, you want them to be memorable, so usually there's something you have to figure out that will make that fight memorable. Be it a piece of landscape, be it a power or two that they have, an objective tied to it, so on and so forth. And also, you have to be willing to forsake certain boss fights. Sometimes events unfold where players avoid it wholesale. Perhaps they did something with the plot you weren't expecting. Perhaps they avoid the area entirely. Who knows? I'm actually going to cut this a little short. And I want to go on to speak briefly about loot. And then we'll go ahead and call it good. Players like loot. Don't forget loot. Loot is good. But the problem with 5th edition is there's nothing to spend your money on. Yes, and loot for the sake of loot doesn't mean much. They just have all this money sitting in their inventory with nothing to use it on. And, yeah. Good approach. So, if you have loot, my personal recommendation is have it be useful loot that the party can use. Like, create items that are either tailored to your party or near tailored to it. Not an item that's perfect fit for somebody but has some interesting abilities all the same. Or they have some objective to spend money on. Again, 5e economy doesn't give you much to work with. But, outside of buying full plate, that's not much else to spend your money on. So, if you drop loot, and please drop loot, don't be me, and forget to give players loot, make sure there's a reason for that. Make sure that there's something they can do with that loot. Otherwise, it is what it is. And in addition to that, experience points. I, as a DM, have forsaken experience points, but I get the point in that they're a nice reward. It's nice getting experience. It's nice seeing you climb higher and higher, getting to the next level. You can gauge how far you are. You can get excited as you build up to it, as opposed to DMs when they drop in like, oh, you've leveled now. And you're like, oh, really? I did? So as a DM, that's a choice you'll have to make. On the one hand, if you choose when the players level up, you have better narrative control over what's going on. And when your players level, granted, you have control either way, period, the end. But the story is more of control versus, fighting until you level up. Conversely, if you run with XP, your players get to see themselves, in a sense, becoming more experienced and stronger, and makes leveling up an event that's easier to look forward to. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and open the floor to you guys for any questions or comments you have in general. Pinkus, since you're here and you're a highly experienced DM, I wanted to ask you about two things. I wanted to ask you about Session 0, your thoughts and feelings about it, and then the first session, particularly introducing the party to itself. All right. Also, for those of you who might be new here, Pincus here is always looking for players. He's doing a series of one-shots, so if you're itching to get into the game, Pincus probably has some game for you. Um, that said, thanks for everyone for coming out. Appreciate that y'all came. And I know I promised I would talk about how to run through. I would run through character creation for 5e, but apparently I'm more mentally exhausted than I thought I would be at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and cut that here. Fair enough. You know what? Go ahead and do that, and then once you're done, I'm going to talk about. I do want to talk about a bit about characters and thematically, and about how to make them and play them, not necessarily the mechanics of making them. So go ahead and talk about session 1. I'll cut it off and I'll start a new recording for that. We did talk about maps. Go right ahead. How nice of you. Plus 5 experience points. Oh, right. Yes. Yes. Pink, thank you for saying that. I want to address something that's really important if you're going to run 5th edition. Inspiration. I forget about all the time, but inspiration is a mechanic that's come up in 5th edition that I actually really like, but I keep forgetting about it. That is, so for those of you who are unfamiliar with inspiration, inspiration is something that you just get. You don't store it. You don't accumulate it. Sorry, you don't accumulate. You can store it, but you don't accumulate it. And you can transfer it to other people for some reason. But basically, inspiration allows you to gain advantage on a single d20 roll. And inspiration is rewarded to you as a player from the DM. As a DM, that is your built-in mechanic for rewarding good RP. That is for when a character does something that you think is really cool or really awesome, or basically whenever you feel like it, be like, you know what? You went above and beyond the Call of Duty. You have inspiration now. And remember, they can't accumulate inspiration. They can't have like 5 inspirations. That's not how that mechanic works. Unless you're breaking the rules and making it work that way, in which case, your game, feel free. But don't forget about inspiration like I do. I forget about it all the time. I feel terrible because it's a great incentive to do cool things. That's Pathfinder. Yeah, it's... And that right there is the exact point. Because the players will see that box sitting on their character sheet, inspiration or hero points, and like, I should be getting these. I want to get these. And you should be giving them out. I hate to say the word should, but obviously you're not obligated to. You don't have to. Yes. Your players will thank you, and it will enhance the moment because sometimes players will be like, I have inspiration, and they'll get excited and they'll get to use it at pivotal moments, and it can really help enhance the experience. Yes, or it might make them a little too brave. Um, Also, as an example, there's a mechanic in another tabletop that had a similar mechanic where players would players would they would get a certain bonus every at the start of every session, and I this is a bonus I really wanted as a player because oftentimes when I play, I tend to RP myself into situations I don't know how to get myself out of, or I don't know what to do next, and I'm struggling to figure out what to say. And this is a mechanic to help players to navigate successfully through a story. Our GM, sorry, was very. They changed it so that we got it a lot more infrequently, and so this mechanic I had basically been counting on wasn't available. Now, to be fair to that GM, he did let us know ahead of time that it would be giving out more sparingly. So, I signed on to it understanding that was part of the bargain, so I couldn't really complain about it. It's just, from a player's perspective, I really wanted and needed that mechanic. Um, So, and speaking of what you mentioned, Derp, I actually do feel that is worthy addressing. Um, what do you do if you have this mechanic, but it feels like your players aren't really doing anything worthy of the mechanic? At that point, I would say use it as a reward for accomplishing things. You know, maybe they performed exceptionally well in a combat, so you give one of them inspiration. Perhaps they accomplish a certain story objective, so you give them all inspiration. Yeah. Um, yeah. Yeah. What? Exactly. Have it adds an extra little incentive to accomplishing something. Like, oh, you rescued the person. Here, have inspiration. And like, oh, I wasn't expecting that. Thanks. So on and so forth. I actually admittedly haven't done that because I haven't thought of that until just now. So from this time forward, my players, I will try and keep that in mind. So hopefully you'll have inspiration more often, because I actually really like that idea. Hero. Assume your players want to be heroes, so they should have challenges worthy of heroes. And don't worry, we can edit it out post-op. Well, we can't do anything about the Twitch recording, but yeah, I am actually recording all this. This is all being recorded on OBS. I mentioned it was being recorded. Well, that's your problem now, isn't it? Anyways, yeah, totally. We'll just silence everything you say. Don't worry about it. It'll just be 3 hours of silence. Is all it'll be. it's Yeah, sorry if you weren't aware that this was being recorded ahead of time. Well, the fact that it's being streamed, but I don't think anyone's really watching the stream anyway. So, okay. Um, that's it. I think. That's it. I think. Did you have anything more you wanted to say about session one? Okay. In that case, I'm gonna go ahead and kill the stream. Thanks everyone for turning up. Appreciate that. If you're interested, hang around. I'll talk for a few minutes afterwards about character creation, not mechanically but thematically, and all that good jazz for a short while. Bye.